cordial welcome to the Sustainability Seminar Series, a monthly public series hosted by the Dr. KIRAN Patel Center for Sustainable Development at IIT Gandhinagar. If you are joining us for the first time, you can learn more about the center and receive notifications about our upcoming programs by completing the form, the link for which has been shared with you in the chat section. We are pleased to welcome our speaker for today's talk, Professor Deepti Ganapathy, who is chair of the Center for Management Communication at the Indian Institute of Management in Bangalore. She holds a PhD in digital communication from the University of Mysore and was a visiting faculty at the University of California in San Diego. Professor Ganapathy has extensive experience as a journalist with India's leading media organizations, including the Times Group, the Deccan Herald, and NDTV. Most recently, she is author of Media and Climate Change, Making Sense of Press Narratives. Professor Ganapathy will make a presentation of about 30 minutes on communicating climate change to a fragmented audience, which will be followed by a Q&A. Please share any questions you have for her in the Q&A box on your screen. We will try to get to as many of them at the end of the talk. Professor Ganapathy.
Thank you, Professor Mehra and Falguni for having me over as part of your monthly seminar series. It's a pleasure to be talking to this interested group of scholars, researchers, and all the audience who've joined into this, to view this webinar, because we are talking about the most important area of research or topic in the century, probably. And as I had shared my abstract with the team at IIT Gandhinagar, I said that scholarship on news coverage of climate change has focused largely on the United States and Western Europe, where climate skepticism has predominantly been the narrative in these countries, and that is need not necessarily the case in developing economies. In Asia, for instance, the continent which will face the brunt of climate change due to its population density, the narrative has been restricted to coverage during calamities or major international environment summits. My research not only draws attention toward current research and climate change coverage by the media, but also critically examines the role played by media to shape the discourse for government and non-governmental organizations to set the agenda. As introduced by Professor Mehra in the beginning, since the worldwide release of my book in November last year and the release of the South Asian edition in June this year, my book is now available in 133 libraries worldwide. And what has been interesting is to see the amount of interest that people from all over the world are showing to understand why communicating about climate change is so important, because more and more we are experiencing an audience that is very fragmented, that have different needs, that associate the interaction that they have with climate change very differently. And therefore, how the communication process should be tailor-made specifically for different types of audience in order to achieve an effectiveness in the communication process, which is ideally to get people, organizations, firms, governments to change the way in which they react and respond to climate change. So just to give you an idea about the type of organizations that have invited me to give my book talk, or to talk about my research, simply to let you know that how diverse an audience is there out in this world to look at why we need to communicate climate change and how its applicability is, so universal in nature. For instance, I started off by talking to the George Mason's University Center for Climate Change Communication. I gave a talk to the Bayes Business School at the University of London, to a sustainability research group, because increasingly businesses, business schools are looking at how do they understand sustainability and business, because they have to reach the goals set by the countries that they operate in, whether it is net zero, whether it is, carbon neutrality. They have to understand these concepts, these terms, and then fit it into their businesses and show that in terms of compliance, in terms of showing that they genuinely and really care about this aspect of climate change. And I'll also be giving there's an upcoming podcast to the Fletcher School at Tufts University to talk about the policy aspect of it. I was very recently invited to Singapore to talk to an audience of climate, of how climate communication is going to become important in political elections, in political communication, and how the next elections or, the upcoming elections in many countries are going to be, seeing this interesting aspect of climate change in how different political parties present their understanding of the issue, and how they use data and how they use the communication aspects to talk about this, to get votes. So this is also very interesting to see how climate conversations are getting into the stream of political communication, as well as how climate communication is getting into the stream of security and peace, given that it is an existential threat in the Pacific Islands, where over a period of maybe 20 years or 30 years, some of the islands are going to be underwater. And then what happens to their maritime water rights? What happens to the citizens who live in those countries, and what happens to their status? Right. So this is the way in which the conversation about climate change is panning out. And that's why I have titled my talk to as, to a fragmented audience, because if you look at the way in which I'm getting invited to different forums and different conferences to talk about it, it just shows how important an issue it is and how diverse an audience is out there to understand the issue. So with that context, let me get into the presentation today. I don't have a PPT deck, but I'm going to help you visualize this entire aspect, because climate change is something that is very difficult to feel, experience, unless it happens to you and me, and then we start believing that it exists. So that was the problem that, when we saw that polar bear standing on that last sheet of ice in the distant North Pole. This picture, along with the headline, "Be worried, be very worried," that was splashed on the 3rd April 2006 cover of the Time magazine, talked about. And the National Geographic and Wildlife magazine's covers also had the polar bear with headlines, "Polar Vortex, Global Warming, Arctic Meltdown." The polar bear, in all its pure white, noble appearance, was appealing to the inhabitants of the entire planet, standing forlornly with its habitat endangered and no other place to migrate to. The subtle messages screamed out loud through this frame. Around this frame, the impact of climate change was meant to be conveyed to the world. The critical role of the centrality that mainstream media or newspapers and magazines played in the understanding of climate change can be interpreted in 3 distinct layers. First, it was meant to highlight the role played by governments in combating the problem collectively. Secondly, it directed attention towards susceptible regions, flora and fauna, as well as indigenous communities that were most affected by the ravages of climate change. And thirdly, the projection of people who were emerging as green warriors, championing for the cause of the environment through their activism and solutions that they offered on the field. So the purpose for me to come out with this book was firstly to draw attention to the fact that reporting of climate change is not only a complex one, but it is a significant one. Coverage of such matters, especially in the press narratives, can have direct policy implications. The coverage of protests, activism can directly or indirectly show how political elites, policymakers, and local administration evaluate these protests as success stories. And this voice of the public can then serve as an opinion when it reaches government agencies through the channels of mainstream media and the news media at large. Second, it has implications on policy matters. Who is benefiting from this narrative and who is losing out is critical to examine. Here, the onus is on media houses and journalists themselves to produce and disseminate facts to the key stakeholders in a balanced and fair manner. Finally, it is interesting to analyze how climate change communication is dissected and decoded amongst the different stakeholders, scientists, communities, media, policymakers, and how they kind of engage in this discourse. And as part of this project, I looked at the Western Ghats and the tagging of the Western Ghats as a World Heritage Site by the UNESCO. I analyzed the media coverage of this issue for 5 years and looked at how the Western Ghats serves as a macrocosm of climate change complexities and how it serves as an eye-opener to make sense of the vast and rich biodiversity that exists in our country and the country's resurgence to improve its economy after freeing itself from colonial rule in 1947. Asian countries, as I said earlier, are facing the brunt of climate change as they toe that line between the path of development, growth, while adhering to COP protocols. We are currently in the 27th year of COP. We are getting into COP27 next week at Egypt. But we still have a lot more to do in terms of negotiating, in terms of going there and talking about things that can be done, or how other countries are kind of putting pressure on countries which are developing just because they think that that's the way forward. So this underlying concept of my work is meant to highlight the significance played by the media, either underplaying or overly highlighting the communication of climate change. To give you an example of this, when I was recently at a conference, I was asked to talk to some of the chosen media persons who are going to be covering COP27 at Egypt. And it was interesting to look that these media persons came from different countries. Some of them came from the Pacific Islands, some of them came from countries that were developing. But predominantly, they came from countries that were facing the brunt of climate change. So when you look at how these media persons are going to be covering COP27, it's clear that they will be covering it from the lens of their own country. They will be covering it from the lens of how they see climate change, the climate events that are happening, whether it is in the form of innumerable hurricanes, whether it is in the form of rising seawater levels. So they're going to be looking at it from that lens, and they're going to be making their stakeholders understand it from that lens. And that is going to have implications, again, on the way in which their government sets policies or their government builds the agenda towards all. So therefore, it's important to look at how do the media co-produce this news? What importance is attached to news related to climate change? And when I say what importance is attached to news related to climate change, is the media consistently covering climate change and putting it on front page, or are they giving it a fair chunk of their overall coverage? Or are they attaching importance to it only when there's an upcoming COP summit, or when the local leader or the country's prime minister goes to a summit of national importance, or when there are extreme climate events? What factors are at play while editorial decisions either project or downplay an event, and editorial decisions are having implications on how big a story is or how small it is? For instance, what my research found was, predominantly the coverage is limited to news reports, whereas in this kind of a climate change communication, it's important to do more investigative pieces, more in-depth analysis, to project a voice and to show what is the stance that different stakeholders are taking in talking about the issue, rather than just objectively covering it as a he said this, she said this happened kind of an event. So also, how does the media industry balance their corporate interests while tackling issues of scientific evidence? And how does a COP summit have themes, or why does it have themes that communicate an overarching message? Is it because certain countries believe that they have to push a certain theme in a certain COP summit, and they set the agenda, or they set the tone for the other kind of signaling to follow. So what is this all about? So when we looked at this, the Western Ghats typically are India's rainforests, and they home around 50 million people. Why it is interesting is while it's the biodiversity, hotspot, it is also a hotspot for economic activity, because there are hydropower projects. There is a huge amount of economic activity that gets generated from the Western Ghats, which spans across 6 states, running from the north to south over a distance of 1,500 kilometers. And it is the source of major river systems, including the Kaveri, the Krishna, the Godavari, the Palar, and the Pennar basins. Now, according to documented reports, Western Ghats cover barely 5% of India's forest cover, but it's home to 1,800 species endemic to the region and consists of 27% of all the species of higher plants recorded in that region, or in the Indian region. A significant amount of industries and resources are found along these ghats that pass through these states, which is on the Western Peninsula. And when the Western Ghats were declared as a World Heritage Site by UNESCO in 2012, the government constituted 2 expert panel committees to give recommendations on the scope and the area of development after it was earmarked as an ecologically sensitive area. So what this means is, if it is an ecologically sensitive area, there is very limited number of economic activity that could be conducted there. And even the indigenous communities that live within the forest and who have been eking out a living by going into the forest and picking wild gooseberries, removing the bark from the trees and making dhoop, incense sticks out of it, even they are allowed to make only a limited number of visits into the forest and take out a limited number of produce from the forest. So this resulted in huge amount of political unrest. There were protests, and crores of rupees were at stake for projects that would have to be shelved. Indigenous communities, like I mentioned earlier, living inside the forest too, were asked to evict, and their livelihoods were on the verge of being wiped away as these forests were now becoming protected reserves. So this construct of the polar bear that I started with seems very far-fetched for people in developing and least developed countries, because many of them are highly vulnerable to the ongoing impacts of climate change, such as extreme heat waves, rainfall, tropical storms, and change in weather patterns. The lack of reporting on localized data on how climate change has affected the local economy may need to be translated into a simpler form for consumption of news in these local communities. If access to local data, experts, and funding to cover climate change is available at the disposal for every journalist, then the press narratives can be consistent and the coverage wider to emit strong signals from ground up. Press narratives have inspired a cultural shift with artists and musicians using climate change, the most pressing problem of this generation, to communicate through their works. For instance, there is this Mysore-based artist who created a canvas which was up for auction at Christie's, and it depicted hundreds of empty plastic chairs strewn at an election rally in India, strewn paper cups, all the garbage generated after the rally was over. Ricky Cage, who was at the launch of my South Asian edition at the IMB campus, where we launched the book, and is a 2-time Grammy winner, uses music to collaborate with artists around the world to spread key messages about conservation and wildlife. So you can see that the impact of climate change has garnered so much of, an expression of, how artists, how the public at large want to communicate about this. And increasingly, the music industry too is looking at projecting a lot of chartbuster, numbers through the portrayal of climate change. And that's also a very interesting thing to see, because we've always seen in history that, these kind of music or artistic expressions have also empowered society and, have, literally shaped social movements. Also, when I also looked at not only press narratives, but I also looked at some of the digital communication, like on Twitter, how recent COP summits have been talked about. For instance, on Twitter, in the COP23, summit, there were a lot of stories that were found on climate change that led into a wider consideration of attention paid to how political leaders were talking about it, how they were tweeting and commenting about what they were doing at that particular COP summit. So in November, when the COP23 summit was held at Bonn, media attention to climate change and global warming was up slightly, which was around 2% from the previous month. And climate change became, an issue that got unprecedented attention from world leaders, media, not-for-profit, activists, industries, and even common citizens. So from 2012, or from 2012 to 14, when I looked at this coverage to now, there has been a whole shift in the way that, the topic of climate change has been covered and discussed. Increasingly, there is a lot of data that is available today, with the journalists or with content creators, and anybody today can become a vlogger, they can become a podcaster, an environmental activist, if they choose to, be an environmental communicator in this time of, communication, because they have access to so much. For instance, an understanding that, the audience would like to see impacts of climate change has got a lot of data or infographics into how heat maps are generated. How, for instance, how was Bangalore city 80 years ago? This year we received copious amounts of rainfall. So there's enough of data or statistics or infographics that the media puts out to show that, this record has been broken because there were so many of rain, or, this was how hot the city was 80 years back, and this is how it was the coldest day for the longest period of time. So this ability to, play around with, interactive graphics to help the audience to feel the heat or to feel the copious amounts of rainfall and how it, is impacting them is very interesting to look at the shift that media has kind of understood. And so they have, started looking at how their audience would like to engage with this, right? And so when coming back to the topic and, why I chose to term this as a fragmented audience, the media understands their audience the best. And if you look at how the media reports about a complex issue like climate change, what they're trying to do is they're trying to understand a very technical, scientific aspect, trying to see its implications on common man, on day-to-day life, and trying to explain that to somebody in a layman's terms, right? And so how do they choose to explain that? Do they choose to explain that through the source of an environmental activist, or do they choose to show that through somebody who has lived that experience, whether it is an indigenous member of the community who's a 90-year-old woman and who recently got the Padma Shri because she's an environmental activist? So how does the media choose to frame this entire narrative and showcase this aspect is the whole, is the whole premise of why the media is looking at different types of audiences and how they understand that the millennials probably want to interact with or communicate with it in a different way. The middle generation wants to understand the problem in a different way, and the older generation would probably, better relate it in this way. So climate change is, as you know, is the most pressing issue of our times. However, the bigger challenge is to influence policy decisions and the public by shaping this information, disseminating this information about climate change, breaking down complex scientific estimates about climate change into solvable components that can be synthesized by the public. And this is a huge challenge for the media. And therefore, given that climate change is here to stay, it's interesting to see how the media is going to assume a greater role in connecting climate science to policy decisions and how the public makes sense of that. Finally, journalists too could have biases based on their own organizational and national influences on the content that they are shaping in the media. And in maintaining the balance between conservation efforts and development, climate journalism or journalists who are reporting must interact and complement these different factors to ultimately empower the public to become a part of the solution and the policy making process. Finally, I think I've come to the end of my 30 minutes. I just want to give you about 5 takeaways, from this talk, and that is the crucial role. We need to understand the crucial role that the media plays as the facilitator between scientists, between policymakers and the public. We need to understand that the media sets the agenda, and how they frame the issue is something that becomes very critical. Today, media is not just about mainstream media, not just the press narratives, but any individual can become a blogger or a podcaster. Managing this narrative is key. Problems of painting a doomsday narrative remain, because the image of a lonely polar bear standing in a distant corner of the world doesn't galvanize behavioral change in our local cities and towns. And it is critical for us to become publicly engaged as scholars. What's happening right now in the field of climate change is that there are scientists who are working in the pure sciences area, are trying to understand how rainfall is the prediction of rainfall, how it is impacting our climate, and how it is impacting different aspects. In physics, in oceans, they are looking at it in different aspects. So they are the pure scientists. Then there are the social scientists like us who are looking at it from the behavior aspect. And then there are, data, there is a whole amount of data and how to make sense of the data. And then you have policymakers. So there is a need for all these people to come together and interact and make sense of what's happening in this discourse, because unless we do that, it becomes very difficult to help the public bring about that behavioral change. And lastly, I stress this fact anywhere that I'm speaking, especially to universities and where there are students, that we must empower the younger generation to become climate action warriors. And why I say this is because increasingly when I speak to young people, a kind of eco-grief is setting in. They are telling us that, we are handing them over a planet which is on its way to doom, and there's nothing that we can do about it. So this concept of eco-grief should not be setting in. The younger generation should be encouraged to become finding solutions in this whole problem, and we should gradually start passing out our knowledge to them. And I'm very happy to say that at my institute, in an upcoming summit on sustainability and business, my students have invited Padma Shri Tulsi Gowda, who's an environmental activist. She belongs to an indigenous community. She wore her indigenous costume and went up and received her Padma Shri very recently. She's, and about 80 years old, but she's going to be coming and inspiring our students. So I'm very happy that, students and the younger generation are seeing the point of tapping into this indigenous wisdom and seeing how sustainable practices were always being followed in society, but where did we go wrong, and how do we now change this and pull our socks up and see that things can be put on a better track. And so with that positive note, I'd like to end my talk, because as I said that I was told it is for 30 minutes and then we can have an interaction. So I'm going to put my talk on pause now and hand it over back to Professor Mehra. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor Ganapathy. We have actually in our audience mostly academics, scholars, I guess, and people who have non-profit organizations who are working in the area of sustainability. And as you mentioned, the climate change is obviously a very complex subject. Complexity is a challenge for the media. who have to write stories that have broad appeal. They are a challenge also increasingly for readers, whose attention span is also diminishing. So can you, both from your experience, I suppose, as a journalist, and certainly from the research that you have conducted on the kind of stories that media are writing, advise us on the scholarly side, who have studies that we have conducted, which we would like to share. What are some of the ways that we can be effective in interacting with the media and sharing our stories? Some suggestions for things that we could do as scholars to make these subjects more appealing to the media people in the first instance.
Definitely, that's a very interesting question, because interestingly, that was one of the frames that came up when I did my analysis of the 5-year study, was that predominantly journalists would reach out, say, suppose there was a climate issue, they would reach out to a pure climate scientist doing research on maybe biodiversity or doing research on an aspect, and then they would talk to them. But by talking to that one scientist, it is not enough to get a broader perspective of the issue. So that journalists would inevitably talk to 2 or 3 different scientists from premier institutes in the city or in the country. And then they would, make sense of what person A said to person B and person C. And then they would then look at, okay, now what is the issue that is happening in this region? And how can I therefore, use what inputs I have got from the scientific community to show what's happening on the ground? And often there was that disconnect between what was happening in the academia and what was happening on the ground, because the ground situation would come up through the journalist stories by talking to people on the field, by talking to people living in the communities there, and their voices and what the scientific community was saying would often not match, right? And when I also did a lot of qualitative interviews with the journalists who are increasingly reporting on environmental issues and scientific issues. And one of the broader things that they said was, you get to read these scientific papers, and often for us, we don't have time to go through those papers, understand the methodology. So if there's one paper saying that, maybe I've looked at, I've done a random survey, or I've kind of, used a closed group to understand this setting, and often the journalist misses that methodology and kind of applies it to the general aspect of the environment without understanding that it was probably done in a lab setting, or it was a controlled experiment, or a randomized trial. So those implications are something that the journalist often has a disconnect with, and there lies the disconnect. So coming back to your point, or the question that you raised, it's something like, when we talk about crisis communication, I always say this: crisis and uncertainty, you have to have a consistent pipeline of communication with the person with whom you're speaking. If there's a calamity and then the journalist reaches out to you, and then you are going to tell him something, and he is not aware that this is the way in which you communicate, or this is probably where you're coming from, it's bound to get misinterpreted. But if you've always been in touch, either through your Twitter or your LinkedIn, or through your publicly available research, where you're trying to make it very, very, generalized so that a common man can understand. And if you had that public outreach, then the journalist in question knows this is how you are communicating about it. So whenever there's crisis and uncertainty and he or she reaches out to you, because journalists always function in, very tight deadlines, they'll reach out to you and then they'll say, give me a quote. And in that quote should be as succinct and as precise as ever. And you should also understand the context and why they are asking you this question. So therein lies the challenge, that if as a scholar, you're not very consistent in your messaging with the journalists or with people whom you interact often, and you are not able to get the context, then in the last minute, when there's an uncertainty and a crisis and they reach out to you for a quote, it often gets misinterpreted. So the key is to be consistent while communicating with a journalist about your work.
Yeah, and you also mentioned earlier that one of the challenges, again, in climate change is that many things we are talking about in terms of their severity are decades into the future. And, one doesn't appreciate the impact unless there's a certain imminence to it. And certainly from the media standpoint also, our news values in a sense are around imminence also. So what are, given that reality, that most of our research is about changes that are so far in the future, how do we relate them more effectively to the present that will have deeper resonance for the media and for the readers?
Yeah, so I think that challenge is there, and all of us strive to be doing our research in streams that have relevance. Sometimes the media doesn't think that it's relevant enough unless, like you said, it's on the radar, like somebody's talking about it or it becomes an issue. But I really don't have an answer to that question, that how do you continue to make the future predictions relevant. But as far as climate change is concerned, I think the theme and the centrality of the topic itself is enough in today's time and age to make anyone understand the significance of a futuristic project that you are doing and its applicability. And the more you try to, be able to relate to something that, is doable on the field, something that, could change things or could change an attitude or could change things for the future, the more you show that implication, the better it is for them to also report about it. Because at the end of the day, I think a journalist or a media person firmly has his or her ear to the ground, or gets a pulse of what the audience wants. So they really know their market. And it's important for you to also understand that and give it to them in that capsule.
Okay, let me ask this question from Aneska Sibek, who has been a visiting faculty member actually with us at IIT Gandhinagar at one point, but she is following us from New York right now. And her question is, because the media are often driven by money, how do the young people and academics overcome the dominance of corporate and fossil fuel-driven messaging?
Yeah, very, very pertinent question. I work in a business school, and I was trying to write a case study, about an organization, but I have to be careful whether they are doing greenwashing or no, right? So that's something that we all have to kind of be very careful about. That, for instance, there was a recent episode about a whole, a newsletter on environment being funded by a fossil fuel giant, right? So it's important to know where the funding is coming from. It's important to know what is the agenda, and that is what I talk about also in my research, where I say that editorial decisions and who is owning that particular media house have an implication on the placement, the coverage, the number of words allotted to that particular topic, and also the the consistent stance. Like, for instance, I have a journalist friend who belongs to the Samoa Islands, and she says that the narrative from the Pacific Islands is always about, them drowning. And she says, we are not islanders who are drowning, right? I mean, we are not submerged yet. But on the whole, the Western media tries to, showcase this aspect through their lens. And so that the wording has to change, the way in which the portrayal of being a victim, that victim narrative has to change. And when that changes, then I think, corporate entities or, who's owning that corporate house will also understand that, that shift has to come, because at the ground level, this is what is being projected. So to answer your question, again, we have to be very careful. We have to look at who's funding, how it is being largely funded. But like I said, today, a lot of young people are not letting mainstream media decide for them. They are becoming their own content creators. They are becoming activists by themselves, and they are, spurring movements. So there's nothing to hold one back. I think, if you know your tools, if you know your communication tools and how to use them, one can, definitely make sense of what's happening and, create that content and create an audience also and understand this fragmented audience and how you want to pitch it to them.
So I guess since we're talking about bias, and certainly media have their biases, which may be corporate driven, or they could have some other agenda differently. Let me flip that a little bit and talk about our biases. Obviously those of us who are in the sustainability space, you use the word warrior, may consider ourselves warrior, or if not, we certainly are advocates on sustainability. The media don't see themselves as that, nor should they see themselves as warriors in that space. So since, if we talk just from a news value standpoint, the fact is that they are not advocates for the positions that we may very well be. So can you speak to, some of the news values that drive the media? Forget the bias part of it, but there's a bias in the media by virtue of the news values also. So looking at the news values, how can those of us who have information that we would like to share ensure that it gets better coverage or more effective coverage within the framework of the media preferences?
Yeah, so interestingly, in one of the chapters in my book, I talk about this aspect of getting communities to report on climate change, because when you talked about this aspect of climate warriors, one instance of it is that, the more you start portraying people as shaping the discussion or taking onus for what happens to their communities, then the media will also showcase it through their voices. For instance, in India, community radio is quite active and very powerful tool in communicating this. And I want to read out an excerpt from a report in UNESCO in 2013, and this was a community radio journalist from Cameroon, not from India, who said that since we started rebroadcasting the COBAM, so COBAM radio program, which is a program on climate change and forests in the Congo Basin, people, particularly farmers, have been coming to our studio for more information on how to deal with unpredictable seasons and have better harvests. So when I was saying, talking about this bias and talking about this aspect of climate warriors, what I meant was that the media has to increasingly look at the source as the communities themselves and involve the communities in talking about the message about climate change itself. For instance, when I conducted my focus group discussions in some of the indigenous communities in the Hills and VR Hills region, I asked them, what do you understand by climate change? And you know what they said? They said that climate change is when it rains in Bangalore city and we watch visuals of roads getting flooded on our television screens in Bangalore city. And the more you probe and ask them questions about how climate change has impacted them or what is climate change, you will know that 40 years ago or 30 years ago, the signs and signals of climate change were already evident in those villages deep in the forests, in terms of decreased crops, in terms of wildlife diminishing, biodiversity loss. So if the media just shifted this narrative and made the local communities more aware that you are the better indicators, you are the indicators of sensing how the climate is changing and you should be communicating about them, and we will use your voices to amplify that. The more the media understands that, then the better it becomes for this narrative to shift from the mainstream or the urban dwellers or the elites to whom it is actually impacting. And that's why I really celebrate the role of indigenous communities and their voices, and how they are so important in this, that the media is missing out on covering how it impacts them, because increasingly our cities are going to be facing a migration from the rural communities, from the rural areas, because of climate change and because it's going to impact productivity on crops, because it's going to have implications on their health. And if we don't start talking about these issues, then we have a problem at hand.
Hey, let me ask this question from Uday Shankar Prasad. It's more of a comment, but I think it would be good to get your comments on that. This is true that media or journalists take approach to make the story simpler. Their purpose is to have a wider readability, coverage, etc. This becomes serious when old data, not well-researched stories are shared. Hence, it is the responsibility of social scientists to present the data and the scientific paper in media as professionals from respective fields.
Yes, and that goes back to what Professor Mehra has also been asking, that how do we make our papers or how do we make our research more accessible? And that is something that, we have to also take serious note of. That is, how do we become more publicly engaged? It's not just because there's an IPCC report on the anvil or there's a COP summit that we show ourselves and say, hey, we are here, we are doing this research, but there should be consistency, there should be communication throughout, and that communication should reach the right channels and it should reach the right audience. So that's a nice comment, but it's also important that one practices it and just doesn't focus on having a certain number of papers and things like that, but how are you actually going to implement it and how are you going to see the impact of it? That is something that one has to think about.
Okay, another follow-up question from Aneska, who actually now tells me that she happens to be in Jaipur right now.
Okay.
And I see a lot of trash on the streets of Jaipur. This is probably due to the lack of proper management by the government. Mm-hmm. How do you see the narratives developing that could instill a sense of beauty and community in people so they don't soil and spoil their environment?
Yeah, I think there's a lot that you can do as well. Like a lot of the civic society in India, a lot of communities, residential communities have been doing that. For instance, if you look at the story about Indore and how it is the cleanest city, you will see a lot of will, not only from the municipal authorities, but also the people, right? Because everybody has to come together in this to solve the problem. So, it's got to do with the community acting together rather than putting the blame on this person, that person. So what are you and me doing in this whole thing, right? There's nothing stopping one from putting together a group, a WhatsApp group or a group on social media and saying, let's clean up this. And many people in Bangalore do that, right? They pick up a wall where people have been urinating and then they, paint it. And then there's a complete change there. People stop throwing trash there after some time. So there's a lot that, you and we can do as, citizens and as community members. And we should stop blaming each other. So that's the whole point. And we should, use better communication tools to start bringing about a change in behavior.
A question here from Chirag Gala. What major suggestions should emerge or be highlighted in COP27?
As you can see, just before the COP summit has started, I'll just share my screen, and because I wanted to also talk about this here. So you can see, just before the COP summit, there are a lot of reports coming out that, we are close to irreversible climate breakdown, one major study. So, and this is my point again, why does this activism or why does this communication get amplified only when there is a major summit happening? And you can see on Twitter, you just put hashtag COP27, you will see a lot of discourse happening. But after a few days, after 15 days, everything dies down and everybody's forgotten everything and gone back to doing what they want to do, right? So that's the whole point in this communication process, that unless there is consistency, unless the messaging is frequent, unless there is no clear call to action, there's very little that one can do on the ground. And it's not just about, like for instance, at this COP27, everybody is going to be asking that question, or that what can we do from now? Have the previous COP26 goals been reached? And it's difficult to quantify it because it's going to take some time. For instance, we are saying 2030, right? Another country is saying 2040. So each country is in a different stage of life. Like I keep saying this, that in India, for instance, we are a developing country. One cannot stop a family which is, struggling hard to, get a house, buy a car, maybe a second car. One cannot stop them and say that you don't progress in life, because progress here has, quantifiable terms in terms of owning a house, owning 2 cars and things like that. So while the developed countries, while Western countries have had everything, and, they want to now look at the developing countries and say, you need to stop doing this. So how do we then make the public at large understand that, you are on your way up the corporate ladder or your aspirations in life, but to do that, you have to think about buying a car or owning a house differently, and sustainability is the way forward. So it's a very different communication process that each country is going to be following. So at COP27, that's something that everybody should be thinking about, that one size fits all approach is not going to work. Each one has to be talking about their challenges, what they are doing. And the most important aspect in this is to stop blaming each other and saying, you are the highest emitter in the world. You are giving 30% of the emissions. So why should we be doing all the talking, right? So the blame game has to stop, and we have to seriously think about how do we, if it's not quantifiable, if it's not measurable, then how do we measure impact? How do we see whether what we are doing in terms of our goals is actually giving us the results that we desire? And that's something that, everybody has to be looking at the COP27. And the more people go to COP27 from different streams of life, the better it will be. For instance, not just policymakers, not just non-governmental entities, but academicians should be there. People from different walks of life who are involved in this climate change conversation should be represented at a COP summit, so that different stakeholders are heard, different voices are heard, and the world at large gets to understand the issue from different lenses. So that's what I think COP27 should be focusing on.
That's a question from Shruti. My question is that on a personal level, how do you start a conversation and push for change towards better environmental practices with those who are cognizant about climate change, but possess a very fatalistic view?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Shruti. So how do you start a conversation with them is, that you have to make them see that, it's going to affect them on a personal level, because climate change is something that is, like I said, not quantifiable. One cannot see the effects of it. So the more you start using evidence, facts, and show them that closer home how it is affecting them, how it is going to have implications, the more you're able to show how each point is related to every other point. For instance, my entire research in climate change started from just a honeybee, right? I come from a tiny district called Coog, and I found that, honey collection had diminished there. And I went to the cooperative societies, and they said that, the honeybee is not getting enough of wildflowers, for pollination. And so it's affecting the production of honey and also the taste of honey. So it started from there, and then the connections grew, and, the interlinkages grew. So the more it started because it started affecting my, the kitchen, what comes into my kitchen, and, what I'm used to. So the more it starts affecting you on a personal level, and, how you interact with a product or a place, and then you see that, okay, over a period of time, this is going to change, and this is how things are going to progress or diminish. That's going to get you to spur into climate action. And the more, we emphasize that even to us children at a younger level in schools, which is happening, I'm sure awareness is there, but the more it's drilled into them at a younger age, the better we are prepared to have, a future, where we have more aware citizens who know how to deal with this, rather than being bogged down by the issue, because it's very easy to get bogged down by the complexity of it.
Okay, this question, Ruchi from South Korea. Will the remedies for climate change be worse than the diseases? Will it drive more people into poverty with higher costs?
Well, I have no answers for that now, Ruchi, but what I can definitely tell you is that climate change is going to have implications on what comes to our dining table, what comes to, what we eat, the food that we eat. And, for instance, I was at Hawaii for a conference, and it was so interesting or notable to see a notice put up in the students' mess at the University of Hawaii, which said, be prepared for disruptions in menu because of supply chain disruptions, right? So what's going to land up? So we thought about, okay, free trade, globalization, food from here, this fruit, this exotic fruit from here can reach another destination. But what is going to happen to the food choices, food preferences, and how is it going to affect you and me? And with that, how is it going to affect the supply chain? How is it going to affect countries which are facing extreme climate events, which are dependent on agriculture? So this is something that is much more, it's going to directly affect our food, and that's something that is at a higher stake than ever.
Okay, last question. If you can speak to, so much of your work has been in terms of traditional media and how they are covering it. I think you have made allusions to social media, and obviously that they are playing an increasingly important role. So as again, people in academia and scholars associated with this work, how can we be more effective in the use of social media?
That's a very interesting question, because I talked about it at a talk to Tata Institute of Fundamental Research as well. And I gave them this example that during the COVID pandemic, we saw a lot of medical scientists, medical doctors who are into research, share their research on Twitter. They became very active on Twitter. Some of them ended up at the White House as policy analysts as well, because they were so accurate with their predictions, their modeling, and they were giving timely advice out there. And they kind of rose up to the occasion. And what was interesting here is that information which they had an audience, right? The timing, the content they had was just perfect at that moment. And so they garnered huge amount of followers. People were eagerly looking forward to what they had to say. They were giving bite-sized information on Twitter. They were putting out complex charts. They were making those charts interactive about the COVID pandemic, and showing prediction modeling and things like that, the surges, what you should be doing, what you should not be doing. So in this whole thing, what became evident was, if you are a scientist and you want to be a publicly engaged scholar, number one, you should have an audience who wants what you are going to say, because it's crucial for them. Either there is, a need for that information because of the context, so they want that information. If they want that information, how are you going to give it to them? Because the medium is important. On Twitter, it's 140 characters, but you can also put interactive infographics. On another medium, it may be different. On YouTube, even we had doctors even on YouTube give out short videos about what to do during the pandemic, and it was very short 3-minute videos. So understand the medium, understand why people prefer to be on that medium, and customize your message accordingly. And lastly, why are they coming to you? Because they believe you have the credibility and you have a pipeline of content to give them. You're not giving it as on a one-off basis, but you have a pipeline of content, right? You have content to give them day in and day out. And that content is only progressing. It's just advancing. There is more content to give them. There is more information. Everybody is, there's this cognitive need that all of us have to be on social media and engage on social media, because we want to be on social media because we want to show that we have higher levels of intelligence. We are capable of sharing information from so-and-so. Scientist is saying this, he or she is going to predict this, and he or she says climate change is going to have implications on the food chain or on health. So we are going to tweet or we are going to like. So important to also understand that why your audience would like to follow you, because you have a pipeline of content that you're going to be giving out to them on a very consistent basis.
Thank you, Professor Ganapathy. And I guess those of you who have been following this talk may want to check out her book, Media and Climate Change, which is, as she has mentioned, was published, I believe, last year, and is now available on this site as well. Thank you for joining us, everyone, and we hope you'll join us at the next edition of the Sustainability Seminar Series next month. Thank you. Bye-bye.